So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. There has been a lot of news and discussion about CPS's budget situation, so we're very happy that you're here with us this evening. This is a webinar where we'll be breaking down the CPS budget for next school year and helping families, educators, and community members understand what's at stake. Over the next hour or so, we'll walk through what's happening with the district's budget, why there's a growing budget deficit, and how some of the issues and proposed solutions, like CPS covering a pension cost or taking on more debt, could directly impact schools and students. You'll hear directly from policy experts, school leaders, and parent advocates, and we'll also share ways that you can get involved to make sure that your voice is heard. We're really glad that you're here, so let's go ahead and get started. So here is a quick look at what we'll be covering this evening. We'll begin with a brief welcome and overview about why this conversation matters. Then we'll walk through some key facts and context about the district's finances, what everyone who cares about our city's public education system needs to know to make sense of what's going on. After that, we'll hear directly from a panel. We'll have a CPS parent, a CPS school principal, and an expert on CPS finances. We'll hear from them about what's at stake in this year's budget and what they're seeing and hearing on the ground. We'll also take a moment to hear from all of you through a quick live poll, and then we'll close out with a few clear ways that you can take action and stay involved in the weeks ahead. So we've got a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. So before we dive into the details, we want to pause for a quick moment and talk about why this conversation is so important. So CPS is staring at a $734 million budget gap for this school year. This number might feel abstract since it feels like CPS is always facing a big deficit, but the impact is very real. When a district has a budget gap this large, it can't just cut around the edges. It might mean fewer teachers in classrooms, larger class sizes, and potential cuts to after-school programs, social-emotional supports, and other services that students depend on. No school would be untouched by decisions like this with a budget deficit this large. That's why we're here, because what happens in the CPS budget affects every student, educator, and community member of our city. Now, what makes this year's crisis even more serious is that a big chunk of the deficit, $175 million, which is a pension payment that is being demanded by the city of Chicago, it isn't even an expense or a cost that CPS has to pay. It would be a choice that CPS would make if it made this payment. So Kids for Chicago, we fought alongside many of you, parents, educators, and community members this past spring for CPS to not make this pension payment to the city. And we won that battle in the spring, but we're back here again. The city of Chicago used to make this pension payment alone without any help from CPS. But now, just like it did in the spring, the city is asking CPS to pay a large portion of it instead. And to make it work, they've suggested that CPS take out a loan or additional debt. But that loan would not go to schools or to help students. Most of it would go straight to City Hall, and it would leave CPS even more financially fragile down the road. This approach would prioritize paying the city over protecting classrooms, and we believe that's the wrong decision. But don't worry, if you have questions, we'll get into this issue a lot more later in the webinar. Now, before we get into the content, we would love for you to take a minute to complete a quick opening survey. This will help us understand where everyone is coming from, what you already know, what you're concerned about, and how you're thinking about these issues. It's completely anonymous, and we'll share what we learned from the group later in the webinar. You can scan the QR code on the screen to get started, or you can click the link that we just dropped into the chat. So we're going to give everyone about a minute or so to fill it out before we keep moving. And thank you really for taking the time to do this. It really helps Kids for Chicago in terms of our programming. Wish I had some good poll taking music, but unfortunately I don't. But so please just take a moment. We will send this out after the meeting as well, but hope we can take some time to take it. Wonderful. Well, everyone is completing their survey. It's a short one. We are going to go ahead and get started. So we'll be getting a deeper understanding about what it comes to CPS's budget. This will include what's driving the deficit and what it all means for students and for schools. To walk us through it, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel Vasecki, who is a policy and research associate at the Civic Federation. Daniel has been closely following CPS finances and is the author of several recent reports that break down the numbers in ways that are easy to understand. We're really grateful to have Daniel's insights today. So Daniel, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Hal. Yeah, let's get into it. So before we jump into this year's budget challenges, we want to give everyone a clear picture of how CPS's funding works overall. Every year, CPS manages a budget of roughly $10 billion, but that full amount doesn't go directly into classrooms. The majority of that money, about $8.5 billion, that's spent on daily operations, paying teachers and staff, providing student services, and keeping schools running. But about 600 million is used for capital projects. That's things like fixing school roofs, updating classrooms, or improving playgrounds. And then about $800 million goes towards paying off the debt from previous years. Let's take a closer look at what CPS can and cannot control in its budget. Of the roughly $10 billion that CPS manages, about $5.3 billion is considered addressable. And that means that CPS has some flexibility about how to spend it. The other $4.5 billion is restricted, meaning that it's legally committed to specific things or tied to grant requirements. So let me give a few examples. Restricted funds include Medicaid reimbursements, Title I funds for low-income students, and early childhood education grants. A lot of that money comes in the form of grants from the federal and state governments, and the law requires it to be spent in specific ways. Flexible funds, on the other hand, are mostly used for basic school operations, like paying teachers, school support staff, covering utilities. So even though they're technically flexible, they're still very critical to schools and students. This matters because when CPS faces a deficit like it does this year, it can't just move money around freely. It's actually unable to cut costs on most restricted funds. Most of the money that's available is already going towards things that no one would want to cut. So let's talk about where CPS's money actually comes from. The majority, about 59% of the budget, comes from local sources, mostly property taxes. That means that CPS is heavily dependent on what it can raise in Chicago alone. Only about 25% of CPS's funding comes from the state of Illinois, and that's below what's typical in other states. In many states, state governments fund roughly 30%, in some cases even 40% of school district budgets. So while Illinois has made some progress in school funding equity in recent years, it still puts more of the burden on local governments than most other states do. And just about 16% comes from the federal government. Most of that is for specific programs like Title I or nutrition services. So overall, CPS is most dependent on local dollars. So when CPS faces a big budget deficit, like this year, it doesn't have very many options to raise more money on its own. State law actually limits how much CPS can increase its property taxes each year. Even if costs rise more than that cap due to inflation or new costs, CPS is still capped. And another source of possible funding is tax increment financing, or TIF dollars. TIF is a tool that the city of Chicago uses to set aside extra property tax money in certain neighborhoods to pay for special projects. A TIF surplus is any leftover money from those special funds that the city can choose to give back to places like Chicago Public Schools and some other public services and local governments. But declaring a TIF surplus, or the size of the TIF surplus to declare, is a decision that's made by the mayor and the city council. CPS doesn't directly control how much money is released. So the bottom line is that when there's a deficit, CPS can't just raise more revenue. It has to either work with what it has or ask for help. Now, federal COVID relief over the last few years gave CPS a significant but temporary boost, about $670 million 2 years ago and $233 million just this past year, a total of about $2.8 billion over 5 years. But that money was always meant to be short-term, and it's going to drop to zero in the coming school year. On top of all that, Other federal funding is now more uncertain. The federal government recently froze about $60 million in title funds that CPS is expected to receive this year, and that freeze alone could make the district's deficit even worse. There's also potential risk to Medicaid reimbursements, which help CPS cover services like special education supports. Those federal shifts could shrink the budget further right when CPS needs more stability, not less. So even though Illinois has made some progress on education funding equity, CPS is still being shortchanged. According to the state's own formula, CPS is funded at about 79% of what's considered adequate to meet the needs of its students. And that means that CPS is hundreds of millions of dollars short every year. On top of that, the state covers only 35% of teacher pension costs in CPS. For every other district in Illinois, the state covers about 97% of pension costs. That's a major financial burden that CPS has to carry alone. And CPS also receives no separate dedicated state funding to fix aging school buildings, and that forces the district to divert operating funds, money that's supposed to go into classrooms, to support building repairs. So looking at this year's budget specifically, this year's budget story has changed a lot from spring to summer, and those changes help explain why we're in such a tough spot now. In April, CPS projected a $529 million deficit, but that number already depended on receiving about $300 million from a city TIF surplus, money that hadn't been officially committed yet. In May, CPS reduced the deficit down to $229 million. This time it assumed an additional $300 million from the city on top of the first $300 million, or from the state. Now again, that revenue wasn't promised, just hoped for. It was this deficit that CPS used when it was giving its budgets to schools. In June, things shifted pretty sharply. CPS added $205 million in new expenses. That includes a $175 million payment to the city's pension fund and a $30 million payment in new charter school costs. At the same time, CPS removed that second $300 million in hoped-for revenue. The result is now a new projected deficit of $734 million. I know those are a lot of numbers and it's a little confusing, but the bottom line is this. The district's financial picture has gotten significantly worse because new costs were added and the extra help from the city and the state has yet to be committed. Let's take a bit of a closer look at the $734 million deficit for the next school year. The $734 million deficit is a result of real changes and choices in CPS's budget. Two big costs were added, $175 million for a controversial payment to the city's pension fund, something that CPS has not been responsible for in the past, and $30 million in new charter school expenses to keep operating 5 Acero charter school campuses in the next school year. At the same time, CPS originally counted on $300 million in extra help from the city or from the state, but the new interim CEO of CPS is not confident that these funds are going to materialize, so CPS took it out of the budget. One piece of help is still on the table. That's $300 million in TIF surplus from the city. That would go a long way towards closing the gap, but the city hasn't confirmed it yet, so it's a risk and not a guarantee. And I'm now going to turn it back over to Hal to talk more about the pension payment. Back over to you, Hal.
Thanks, Daniel. And for anyone who has any questions, you can certainly leave them in the chat. We've got some team members who are responding to them, but thank you. So we are now going to talk a little bit more about this MEBF, this pension payment. So let's take a look. This is really one of the biggest drivers in this year's deficit, which is the $175 million pension payment to the city's MEBF fund. Now, this $175 million payment is about a quarter of the entire district's deficit. That means that every 1 in 4 deficit dollars is supposed to go to the city, to City Hall, not to CPS students. Or to put it another way, $175 million is the equivalent of paying around 2,000 CPS teachers for a full year. Now, this MEBF pension fund, it does cover some CPS non-teachers, as well as City of Chicago employees. But the legal responsibility for the fund belongs to the city, not CPS. And for nearly a century, the city made this payment without any CPS contribution. The only time that CPS contributed was during the pandemic, when it had those extra one-time federal dollars. We talked about that $2.8 billion that came from the federal government during the pandemic. But now CPS is being asked to make a payment every year. But the law hasn't changed, and this is still a 100% city obligation. If CPS pays it, that money comes straight out of schools. CPS has no way to pay for it other than by cutting its expenses. Now, it is true that most of the people in MEBF and the MEBF pension fund, about 60%, are either current or retired CPS employees. But here's what's important. When you look at the actual costs of the fund, only about 1/3 of the total pension liability, the kind of the costs that are being borne, are tied to CPS workers. So that means that 2/3 of the costs connected to the city employees and retirees, not to CPS. Now let's be clear. If CPS pays the city's $175 million pension bill this year, that money has to come from somewhere. And in this case, it comes directly out of classrooms. That means less funding for teachers, after-school programs, social-emotional supports, and more crowded classrooms. There's no new revenue coming in to make up for this cost. Now, should there be a long-term plan for CPS to help support the MEBF pension payments? Probably. But we just had Daniel walk through how CPS is funded. It has almost no power to raise new revenue, while the city of Chicago has many, many, many more options. Until there's a plan in place that doesn't take resources away from students and schools, CPS should not be expected to pay. Our schools and the children and educators in them shouldn't bear the cost of what is ultimately the city's responsibility. Now, previously, the city has proposed that CPS should take out a loan to make the $175 million MEBF pension payment. But let's be clear, this loan wouldn't go to keeping schools whole. It would mostly go to cover the $175 million pension payment. That is a cost that, again, CPS legally doesn't owe and has no viable way to pay for. Right now, as Daniel said, CPS already spends over $800 million a year paying off previous loans. That is about $2,200 per student that is diverted away from the classroom to pay to banks to pay for past debt. Adding even more debt now would only make it harder for CPS to invest in students next school year and future years due to the increased interest costs. In short, taking on more debt is not a real solution. It doesn't bring in new funding, it doesn't protect schools, and it kicks the can down the road while raising long-term costs. We need a better answer than saddling CPS and our students with even more debt. Now, taking out a loan might seem like a quick fix, but it creates longer-term problems. Every dollar borrowed today means more interest to pay tomorrow, which increases next year's budget deficit. If CPS's credit rating drops, current debt would come with higher interest rates, making existing debt payments even more costly. And if there's another emergency, whether it's financial, related to student needs, CPS would have fewer options to respond. That's why borrowing now is so risky. It trades today's relief for tomorrow's problems. Now, we all hope that CPS can close its budget gap this year without any more cuts to schools. But even if we do, we're not out of the woods. In just a couple of years, CPS is projecting $1 billion shortfall. CPS's budget challenges isn't just a temporary problem, it's a structural challenge. That's why a short-term solution like a loan won't work. CPS needs new, ongoing revenue and sustainable changes to keep classrooms funded. Otherwise, we'll be in the same or even a worse budget crisis every single year. Now that we've walked through the numbers, we're going to shift to a panel conversation that's focused on what's truly at stake in this year's CPS budget. So what it means for students, families, educators, and the future of our public schools. Moderating this discussion is Daniel Anello, CEO of Kids for Chicago. Daniel has spent more than a decade working alongside families, school leaders, and policymakers to push for more equity, transparency, and parent voice in education. Daniel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Hal. Thanks everyone who can join us tonight. I feel honored to be able to introduce our panelists here. And I'm excited to kind of dig in and hear their perspectives. We have a parent, we have a school leader, and we have a civic leader who's been deeply involved in this issue for a very long time. So I'm going to start by introducing my friend Claiborne Wade. He serves on our parent advisory board. He's an advocate. He's a parent of 4, and he's a leader who's been leading work on the West Side for quite a while now. He and his wife are proud parents of children who attend DePriest. He's pretty involved in DePriest. He's part of the Sustainable Community Schools parent as a parent coordinator. He works through Family Focus out of Lawndale. And he's been with us for, I don't know, Claiborne, 5, 7, a while. And importantly, he serves on boards of Catalyst Circle Rock and Catalyst Maria, and he continues to try to convince me to golf with him, which at some point I will get to trying out. But welcome, Claiborne. Second, I want to introduce Principal Davy Aguilar. Davy, Principal Aguilar, she leads Alexander Graham Elementary School in Canaryville neighborhood. She's now in her 4th year as a principal, but she began her career as a special education classroom assistant at just 18 years of age. She's been a fierce advocate for students ever since she started, and she's known for her deep commitment to building relationships and supporting both academic and social emotional growth within our students. Principal Aguilar's leadership is grounded in integrity, humility, and the community. And then finally, we have Joe Ferguson, who's the president of the Civic Federation. Joe, welcome. He brings a wealth of experience in government accountability, oversight, and reform. He served as Chicago's Inspector General for over a decade, and he's pretty widely recognized for his work to improve transparency and performance, specifically in the city government. Joe is also a professor at the University of Chicago and Loyola Law School, and a longtime leader in civic reform efforts across this city. So welcome, everyone. Give me a moment as I move my notes. And we turn down the images. So I'm going to start with an opening round question for everyone. And I'm going to go in the order of Claiborne to Principal Aguilar to Joe, Mr. Ferguson. But starting with you, Claiborne, from your perspective, how did CPS end up in this financial situation that we just heard Hal and Dan walk us through? You know, what factors do you think contributed to it, and what could have been done to help prevent it?
Great question, Daniel, and I appreciate being on with you. You know, I feared that this day was going to come. You know, I'm not going to blame it all on CPS, but I believe that the ESSER dollars had a lot to play in this. You know, everyone, you know, across the district, across the state were receiving funds from the federal government during the COVID season, rather. And, you know, it was, I think particularly it was like 2.8 billion CPS received. And with those dollars, I believe, you know, extra support in the classrooms, extra nurses, counselors, all those positions were being brought on with the ESSER dollars. And again, I feared that this day was going to come, trying to sustain those positions. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, it didn't caught up with us. And I'm hoping that we could, you know, dive more into the conversation or have that conversation tonight.
Thanks, Claiborne. Same question for you, Principal Aguilar. You know, from your perspectives, how did we get here? You know, what contributed to it and what might have been different?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I think from my perspective, I'm going to go obviously the principal route, right? And we're definitely problem solvers. So I think my focus is really on how do we resolve it and how do we not let it happen again? And whatever decisions that we are making, we are definitely keeping our students' best interest at the center. I also think that a lot of this has to do with long structural issues, right? Also, the rising operational costs, such as salaries, benefits, facilities maintenance, transportation, have increased that pressure in our budget. Another factor may also be the declining student enrollment, which can lead to reduced funding and increased per pupil costs, especially when fixed costs are remaining high. I think looking forward, it is critical to adopt a transparent budgeting budgeting practices. For me, this means definitely engaging stakeholders in the financial planning process, clear communication, communicating challenges and decisions, using the data, right? At the same time, there must be a continued and consistent focus in supporting our students' needs, investing in continuing to invest in our schools so they are safe and inclusive environments, keeping in mind our teachers, right? Recruiting and retaining those high quality educators and ensuring that students continue to have access to all of the opportunities, academic enrichment, and the supports that are going to make them thrive. I definitely think, always whatever decisions we make have to be with our students at the forefront.
Thank you. Joe, same question for you.
I think first sweeping broadly for everybody, at bottom, we keep adding to our spending when we know we don't have the revenue. And that ties into what Claiborne and in some respect reference with respect to ESSER money. We literally during COVID increased our overhead for operations. We increased staffing by over 20% and did not do planning for what would happen when those funds would run out. And so here we are with expanding programming, which everybody could agree this is important and needed programming, but we did not do what every other household needs to do, which is say, okay, where's the money going to come from if we're going to spend more? There are a couple of elements to that that are really, really huge, that are not the fault of people who actually are running the system at this point, because they literally go back decades. One of the huge overhangs to the district, the millstones around its neck, has to do with pensions. And that goes all the way back in time to the 1980s, where there were agreements that were reached that lowered the obligation of teachers by contract of having to contribute a full amount to their pension that was left to the district to have to carry the burden of. And then in the 90s and in the early 2000s, we had pension holidays in which literally governmental bodies, including CPS, were permitted not to make the employer contributions. And then some shocks from the economy, and we invest our pension funds to earn money. And there have been a couple of major shocks. That has resulted in a massive amount of burden on the system and diversion of funds that otherwise would go to programming. With one other element here is CPS does not get funding from the state in the same way that all other districts in the state get funding for pensions. CPS gets about 35% of its teachers' pension fund contributions covered by the state, and for the rest of the systems in the state, it's 99 to 100%. That is a huge number right there. And so that's pensions in a big way. COVID, ESSER money coming during that period. We increased operations without anticipating the fact that that money would run out. And Davey noted that, we're problem solvers. Principals are problem solvers. We're all problem solvers here. We also have to recognize historically, we are extraordinarily creative in coming up with short-term solutions to our problems without thinking of the long-term consequences. And they have built upon each other over years and literally decades. And that goes to things like not adjusting our infrastructure to sustain our facilities at the levels that we want, which means now we have to invest even more for those facilities. We're not right-sizing the facilities overall to an actual shrinking population. There are many, many causes here. And there is a lot of heat and fury in recent times over who's at fault. We have to move beyond who's at fault, because in some fashion, just about everybody involved in some way over the last 40 years has a role in where we are right now.
Thanks, Joe. Sobering, but also, yeah, like the compounding result of short-term solution after short-term solution is definitely something that sticks with me. A question that I will throw into the chat, not to be answered here, is just what percentage we talked about 600 million going to capital, 800 million going to debt service. And I'm like, what percentage of the overall $10 billion is going to pension, kind of based on some of the things that you called out? You may know the number off the top of your head, but I'll let Hal or someone on the team hopefully throw that into the chat. I want to pivot back to Claiborne. And Claiborne, I'm just asking you to put on your parent hat in your role as a coordinator at DePriest Elementary School, and tell me, maybe you've seen some of these cuts come before because you've been there for a while. Maybe not, but what are the things that you anticipate kind of impacting your school community specifically right now?
Well, actually, and I take my hats off, Principal Aguilar, and principals across the district, because I know that when it comes down to cuts, it's never easy. And I say that because right when I guess the budget hit, I received, or it was a week after the budget had hit, I received an email from, our assistant principal at the priest, indicating that, due to budget cuts that, he would not be returning. And then just yesterday, I saw a video on social media that our, beloved music teacher would not be returning. So, we're feeling it, and it's sad, and hopefully, um, you know, we won't have to deal with this, year after year. And I know Joe mentioned this earlier. I believe that all the dollars that we received in the beginning from ESSER funds and all that good stuff. I believe that if we got those dollars, coming up with a plan to sustain after they're gone, I think that should have been a part of the planning strategy once those dollars came in. And I don't think that we would be in this situation right now.
Yeah. Principal Aguilar, per Claiborne, just like in your comment of just like being a problem solver in the moment, as you look at these financial challenges, like what are the top priorities for you when it comes to what you want to preserve, particularly student success at your school and student learning? And, what are you protecting, and what are you afraid that, like, regardless of what you're protecting, given the deficit, if it is 730, you won't be able to?
Yeah, there has definitely been a learning curve for me as I begin my fourth year in a budget. This is my first experience with a budget this difficult and this challenging, right? So I was definitely forced to make decisions. I think for me, it was essential to protect the core components that directly impact our students' learning, well-being, and development. For Graham, we had to make the decision in protecting that we were going to go on our own to give the students the other experiences, right? For example, going on field trips, things like having an organization come in and provide enrichment for them, right? So we started by protecting everything within our building. And then my assistant principal, who's amazing, and I took on the responsibility of really forming partnerships with external resources to continue to give students that opportunity to be out of the building and go on field trips, right? I mean, even the increase on buses. I remember when it used to be $250 round trip. Now we're looking at about $750, even going half a mile, right? So like we're working really, really hard to protect that piece, but that has become a full-time job on its own for us, in addition to what we do on a day-to-day basis, right? I want to share that at Graham, our school mission is learn, grow, and play together. And this is something that definitely guides every decision that we make. We want to continue to give our students and prioritize that piece of our community, right? We were very transparent with our staff, and we said, like, if you know of anyone that can partner up with us and help us make things happen, right? And again, just really keeping our students at the forefront, and it begins in the classroom. And then we took on the responsibility of figuring everything else out. And, as we go, we are learning what works and doesn't work. But yeah, this definitely has been different, to say the least. And I cannot imagine, if we had to make these decisions, I'm sure 100% that a lot of my colleagues had to make even tougher decisions, as Claiborne was explaining with their music teacher.
Yeah, thank you. It's sobering to hear you talk about adding yet one more hat to wear. You're basically doing a fundraising function for the school in addition to everything else, just to try to sustain, those wraparound services. So kudos to you for doing that, and your assistant principal. But I'm also like, is that really the thing that you should be spending all your time with as well? That's difficult. Joe, I'm coming back to you. We talked a little bit about this earlier. Hal went through some of the slides, but CPS employees, they participate in the MEA BF pension, yet the district doesn't have kind of the city's revenue raising powers. What do you think is a fair compromise? And you can talk about it like short term and long term, because maybe they're different, but what's a fair compromise when you look at this pension?
Obviously a critical issue in this moment, as Hal and Danny highlighted. Before going there, I just want to sort of quickly tell you something that occurred to me as Principal Aguilar was talking. And that is one of the reasons we've gotten to this place is that we haven't approached our children from a whole of government perspective. And so the school system itself has had to carry more and more of the burden directly, and the burden of the consequences of children being failed in their communities, in the neighborhoods themselves. And that actually is part of the raising of the overhead that we need to attend to, because the long-term solutions are going to have to involve other units of government here coming in and doing what they're supposed to be doing as well. As to the MEABF, there's nothing to be done this year. That is locked in. What is being talked about right now, and I know this probably hovers in other thoughts and questions, Daniel, that you may have for us, is that as stated in the presentation, that's money that the city is legally obligated to pay, going back 100 years. The system is very non-aligned with what the realities are, which is well over half of all of the members of that particular pension fund are CPS non-teachers. Over 30% or so of the money that has to be paid in every year is for those teachers. That's because the city employees that are part of that same pension plan actually make more money than the non-teacher CPS employees. But what needs to be done here is this. Right now, the city holds all the levers for revenue generation for that fund. It has the responsibility. It therefore should hold the levers. It has more levers available to it. When I say levers, they have other ways of deriving income other than the very, very limited property tax heavy lever that CPS has. What needs to happen is that system needs to be brought into revenue capacity alignment for CPS itself to take on that responsibility. It probably should be done in a dedicated way. CPS is given specific authority to raise revenue through a specific means that has to get dedicated to that place. One of the curious things that I stumbled across recently is this is a CPS non-teacher heavy system at this point in time in terms of numbers. There are no members of the board that come from CPS non-teachers. They're all on the city side. It is managed within operations that are controlled by the city. We actually need to say, all right, long-term, This is a CPS responsibility. CPS needs to be given by the state the capacity to raise the revenue to meet all of the obligations that legally exist here. That is going to take, negotiations with Springfield, and it's going to take the city being willing to take its hand off the checker for something that it has some benefit itself from continuing to control how the pension fund is actually invested and operated.
Thanks, Joe. And just to make it really practical for, if those are on listening and watching this conversation, can you just give like an example of like that abstract, like where is it happening now and what does it look like in practicality?
There's the capacity for special dedicated taxing authority that again, dedicated is the important part. The problem right now is anytime we're talking about more revenue, we're talking a question of trust as to whether that revenue is going to be applied to the specific purpose. This is a pretty significant form of entanglement between the city and CPS. It has to be dedicated. The city itself has more property tax capacity and authority in some respect. It has special levy authority that CPS doesn't have. These things the special levies need to be tied specifically to this fund, whether it's property tax or another form of taxation that goes specifically to this purpose.
Yeah, which exists in other districts across Illinois. Yeah.
Yes.
Good for okay. Thank you. Claiborne, sustainable community schools. When you think about all of those wraparounds, all the special benefits that come to the school through that program, what are cuts in the classroom funding? How are they going to affect that? How do you think that they're going to show up in the wraparound supports that your school is providing right now?
Well, you see, we even being a sustainable community school, we're feeling the cuts. But due to working with the lead partner agency, Family Focus, those wraparound support services aren't being cut. We're just seeing it at the school level, where our nurses and it is being felt across the district. Nurses being cut, like I said, assistant principal, music teachers, librarians. It would be great to have a sustainable community school across the district, across the state. But even with being a sustainable community school, we are still feeling those cuts, and we may have to take on some of the responsibility of the services that we're missing throughout the school day. Maybe sitting down with the leadership team, figuring out what were those cuts, and maybe we could put into our SCS, Sustainable Community Schools budget, to kind of offset that void.
Okay. And for you, like what are parents like in your community saying right now about their top priorities? Like, are they just like, are there a lot of people kind of up in arms? Are they still kind of finding things out? I mean, we're running this webinar partly to make people more aware of all this that's going on, because not everybody is watching all the time, but I'm curious what you're hearing at the priest.
Absolutely. So, in a perfect world, we don't want to cut anything. We want to, make sure that our classrooms remain small. We want to make sure that we have a teacher assistant in the classroom. As I mentioned, we're going to have nurses, music teachers, counselors, resource coordinators in the schools. And that's how it should be. So all those that I just listed is the priority in the budget that the parents, don't want to see cut. And communication. And I give it to CPS. I think that they've been doing a fine job with making sure that our community, our families, parents are part of the conversation, and I think that's extremely important as well. Having our parents give their input on some of the budget line items. Is it perfect? Maybe not, but we're being invited to the table.
Thanks, Claiborne. Principal Aguilar. So schools out of the gates in the summer, you heard 229 million, which I'm curious, I guess it's a two-part question. Like, I'm curious what your reaction was to that. How credible did you think it was? Like, were you skeptical out of the gate? Because I've heard rumors that folks are like, hey, wait a minute, that sounds really optimistic, particularly with the 600 million in TIF. And then fast forward to where we are now, and there's a pretty stark pivot from 229 to 730 million. You talked a little bit about communication, so you can talk to that, but what was your first reaction? What are your thoughts on how that was communicated? And just generally speaking, like, how does a principal navigate that flip-flop or pivot?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, challenging. I think as principals, we always appreciate the clear and early communication. And it's almost like a band-aid, right? Just rip it off. Just tell us how it is. As you said, we're in the middle of summer planning. Just let us know what it is so we can plan accurately. I think another challenge that we have is a lot of times we are placed like in the middle of communicating with staff and parents as we receive information, right? And it becomes a really big challenge to say one thing and then it changes, and then going back and retracting what was said or what the plan is. So again, I just think that we would all appreciate if just give it to us like it is, good or bad. We make tough decisions on a daily basis, and this is a difficult one, but it has to be made. We don't have any other choice but to make the decisions. So having the accurate information from the start definitely supports the trust. It allows us to collaborate with our teachers, with our community, and it helps us ensure that we are still covering the needs of our students, in that planning process, however it looks like, that might look like in our different buildings, right? So I think just in any situation, clear and proactive communication is key to support us make the best decision possibles for the communities that we serve.
No, thank you. And I'm not going to put you on the spot fully, but I'm curious, did you start planning early on, or did you kind of wait? Did you feel like the dust needed to settle?
Yeah. I'm a planner. I'm going to speak for myself, right? Not for my other colleagues, but I'm a planner. So we had plan A, plan B, plan C.
Yeah.
Right. And I can tell you plan A, plan B, plan C did not work for us. So we had to draft a plan D that combined all of the other plans, right? I think the approach for principals is different. Again, I think it depends a lot on our communities and what the needs of our students are. So we had a plan and it didn't work. And we had to scratch and adjust and borrowed from the different things we were thinking. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, right? But it's the best we can do for what the card we have been dealt.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that coupled with what you said before about how much work you're doing to try to find partners to help that. And I'm like, okay, you're building all these plans. That's hundreds of hours of work with your team. And then you're also out trying to, so my hat goes off to you for just the incredible amount of work that is. So thank you. Joe, what are the immediate consequences? What are the long-term consequences for CPS if we resort to a high interest debt borrowing scenario to cover our operating costs?
So this is a third rail at this point for all sorts of reasons, not just the political ones between CPS and the city, but also the relationship between CPS and the credit markets. So right now, CPS's credit rating is junk status. It borrows mostly through issuing bonds. So it is already in junk status. Junk status means it costs more money in interest on the market when you float bonds for whatever purposes. And it is really, really poor and frowned upon practice to borrow money for operating costs. Think of it this way. We all borrow money to buy a car. We don't borrow money to put gas on the car. And eventually, if we keep borrowing money to put gas in the car, our creditor is going to cut us off, and it means the car won't run anymore. And something like that is sort of what we're looking at here. If we borrow money, and the conversation right now is about that MEAB payment that the city is looking for to get from CPS. One, we're doing it at a high interest rate, and so it's going to be costly on its own terms. Second, it's likely to have the consequence of lowering our credit rating even further. And in a worst case scenario, actually start to constrict the district's capacity to borrow money at all for any purposes. That back in 1980, in a what seemed to be a much more dire situation. We're not there, but these things sort of move very quickly. Resulted in the credit markets actually stop lending money to CPS altogether. And at that time, that happened in 1980. And the result of that was that something called the School Finance Authority came into existence in Springfield. And this is the sort of thing that comes up with units of government that are in sort of severe fiscal crisis. Is somebody at another level of government says, okay, we have the capacity to leverage credit and to get credit for you, issuing bonds ourselves. But in return for that, we need to take over all of the fiscal parameters of how you're conducting yourself, not the curricular decisions, not what's happening at an individual school level, but says these are the guardrails within which that money must be used. You have to balance the budget. You can't in real ways, not in fake ways. You can't borrow for operating costs. So there is a sort of quick set of risks here that impact the district. And if it borrows now, it gets a short-term gain, it believes, by being able to continue to operate. But there are almost immediate consequences that follow. Restriction of the bond market, lower of credit rating, more cost to actually do business because the amount of your borrowing costs more, and the possibility of some degree of outside takeover of its finances.
I really like your metaphor of the car. That is a good way to kind of capture with the gas. And Claiborne, I don't know if you wanted to jump in. I saw you getting animated on your side, just in terms of thoughts on it, and either of the other panelists want to chime in on any of these things, feel free to jump in. You don't have to, but and then the one other thing that I'm thinking about, and I think we didn't do this at the top of the call, but like for those of you who know us, who are joining us and recognize kids, like we anchor our stuff and our positions on what we're hearing from parents. And I will say that it is rare for parents to be a monolith on anything. In our network, there's people with different views on all kinds of things. And this loan was one of the few. Two things have come up in the last year where it was pretty unanimous, where people felt things needed to fall. And one was, we need to do more focusing on student learning and outcomes. Like, why aren't we talking about kids? And then the second was really people understanding very quickly this was basically paying for credit cards with other credit cards, or in your analogy, using your, borrowing to pay for the gas for your car. So all of that is incredibly resonant. I know we have a few minutes left. I want to make sure there's no questions from the audience. Hal, I'll let you chime in if there's any specific ones that were raised that you think. So just interrupt me at any time. Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving forward.
And there was one question, I think, just about the prospect of the state and or city providing additional dollars to CPS, either in veto session for the state or through the city budget process, which we know is due in December.
Joe, you want to that one?
Sure, yeah. I'll jump into that. The old cowboy movies, the saying was "Slim and none," and Slim just left town. And here's why: it's not because the state doesn't want to help CPS. I'm sure that the leadership in Springfield is just as concerned about children and the impact of the failing system, because it doesn't just affect the children, but it affects the families, the city, and as the city goes, so goes the state. But there needs to be an understanding of a couple of things here. The state itself is in the middle of a significant set of fiscal challenges. The transit system is $750 million, has a fiscal cliff of that amount, so they have to find that amount of money. And what's happening in Washington is directly impacting the state in a major way. It has reverberative effects on CPS itself, but one example is the cuts in Medicaid that will be coming will be of major impact on the state. And there are other things. And so the state really has to tend to its own business in some respect. The other thing is these things at the state level are complex, both politically and from a policy perspective as well. People have thrown out there, or some advocates have thrown out there, the education-based funding model. We should be funded at 100%. We don't have a right to 100%. That was actually an aspiration and projection. And the agreement was over time it would be 90%. And folks have said, just give us, give CPS what it deserves based on that formula. But you can't just do it for one district. If you do it for one district, you have to do it for the entire state. And so what would be a couple $100 million for CPS would cost $4 billion because it would need to be done statewide. So the feasibility in terms of policy and politics really means that nothing's going to happen in the veto session as it relates to CPS.
Sobering and just real. So I think there's going to be more like we got to survive by community. And I also think that the hopes of the federal system stepping in to intervene is also slim leaving town. So Principal Aguilar, I'm going to pivot back to you. If you have to make difficult cuts, when do you make them? Like, is it better to make those at the beginning of the year, or say this thing drags out and decisions are happening? Like, what happens if it's made mid-year? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, for me, making cuts, it's never easy, right? However, definitely before the school year starts. I think mid-year cuts are incredibly disruptive, and it's that planning again that happens, right? Like right now we're planning for all of this. And when you plan for the support and you start the school year with the support and teachers have the support, and then you're going to take that away, we have to go back to the drawing table and replan everything, right? But I think bigger than that, when you give that support not only to the students but to the staff, right, and you take it away, it has such a huge impact. It has an impact on the school culture, on the staff morale, on the day-to-day operations, right? And then the consistency for students is not there anymore. So I think that a lot of my colleagues would agree that starting with what we are going to start with, whether it's the cuts, let's just get it done and we'll figure out the year, versus starting and then having it to do midway through the year.
Okay. And your chance for a public service announcement, request, ask, what can the district leadership, what can the district do to support principals the best right now when it comes to what's going on?
Yeah.
Comms, but.
Yeah. I definitely think, that communication and that transparency is key. It's really hard, right? And I get it's really hard, but I think everybody is looking for that. I think another thing I would say is I would love for them to be at schools a little bit more, right? These decisions are being made for schools, but really understanding how different the schools are, and what the different needs are. And then really, not that they're not doing it, right, but continuing to hear us out on what we need and why we need it, giving us that autonomy to make those decisions to better support our schools communities. We are there every single day, right? And we know what our community needs. So really just really lending that ear to hear us out.
Thank you. Claymore, back to you. So thank you. You're the chair of our equitable funding task force. I know you're familiar with the question that Joe answered around
Yeah.
going downstate and trying to compel them to put more into the evidence-based formula. So for you, like, what's the single biggest move CPS could make right now to ensure fairness, stability, and funding across the district?
You know, I think that Joe, alluded to it earlier. I don't, the relationship, whether or not, Springfield's going to give. Well, I don't even say whether or not. I think they already made the decision that, giving more money is probably not. Um, they're not going to do it right now. But I believe that, I'm every year. I'm tired of going back and forth. Every year we come back to this, to the table, trying to figure out how much, to give the schools and, where we're going to cut at from our schools. I believe that if our schools, if we give the monies that each school needs to operate, I'm speaking in a perfect world, and it should be a perfect world when it comes to educating our kids. We have, parent mentors, we have counselors, we have school nurses, resource coordinators, whatever it takes to make sure that our scholars are educated. Give that to each school across the district, across the state, and fund it to where it needs to be. So the school should not be subject to appropriation. The budget, it should be a line item, I believe, and it should be a line item in the budget every year to fund each school at this level. So we don't have to continue coming back to the drawing board year after year, cutting our schools when, our kids are our future. We're talking about future entrepreneurs, future members of Congress, future, business owners, like whatever it takes. And spending whatever it takes. I mean, because money should not be an option when it comes to educating our scholars, our young folks.
Mm. So I saw a question in the Q&A a second ago that I'm sure one of the team is answering, but I'm going to pose it to you, Claiborne, because I think you can speak to it, and others feel free to chime in. But what is something that I know you're deeply involved with us, but what's something that parents should be thinking about doing right now in this difficult time themselves, like either in support of their schools, advocating, like what are some, like, just ideas, thoughts for the people who are listening?
Oh man, I think they're looking at my notes here. So look, and I'm not saying it's just because I know you, Dan, you on your team, your staff, but or even being a PAB member, but you all, Kids for Chicago, give parents, they have a voice, but you all help elevate their voice, give them the necessary tools that they need to elevate their voice and pull up a table, put up a seat to the table to give their ideas on how the school should, operate, or some of the things that they need. And you all do a wonderful job at that. Continue to fight. I mean, the parents, believe it or not, I mean, your voice is huge when it comes to, decision making at your kid's school. Whatever it takes to get inside, become a part of the parent advisory board at your school. Become a part of the local school council at your school. Whatever it takes for your voice to be heard and to be a part of those decision making tools at your school, because this is the time to get involved. Especially we seeing how things are shaping out in Washington. Dismantling the Department of Education. I know Joe had mentioned it earlier, but that's going to be another thing that the state's going to have to pick up, that Title I funding, and we already searching and looking for more money to make sure that our schools are funded at a level that it needs to be. So just continue to be involved and advocate for your scholars, your young people.
Thank you. And I was not fishing for a plug. Thank you. But I was just, I think it's helpful for other parents to know kind of how you've gotten involved in just different ways. I love pushing people to get on the LSC. Davey, yeah, I see you coming off mute.
Yeah, I think I can answer this one a little bit or have a recommendation, right? I think for us, we are very transparent with what we are working towards. So our families know that we are looking for people to help us continue our back to school bash, our fall fest, right? And they are very good about, I just had a parent saying, hey, Ms. Aguilar, I will do the back to school backdrop, right? She does like all of these decorating for parents. And I couldn't be happier, and so just said thank you, thank you, thank you. Right? We had another parent reach out and say, "Hey, I have a contact at Vienna Beef, and they are going to donate your $400 for the fall, your 400 hot dogs for the fall fest." Right? But I definitely think there's something to be said. If you don't know how you can help your school, definitely reach out to the principal. Right? I think for me, I understand that our families also have a lot going on, and it's hard for me to reach out to them. But when I get an email or a text from a parent that says, "Hey, can I help out with this or can I help out with that?" It's really exciting, right? It's really exciting. So I would definitely recommend reach out to your school principal and ask, "How can I help?" Right? And I'm sure they will be able to tell you. Again, different schools have different needs based on their current situation. So the need is different for all of us.
And
Thank
if
you.
I may, Daniel, please, Principal Aguilar, and I appreciate you. Principals, have a major role in, making that space for parents warm and welcoming. So, Principal Aguilar, I appreciate you for doing that. It starts with the principal, and if the parents see that the principals are looking for the help, welcoming, the parents in, understanding that your students, your scholars go here, and just like they go here, you are welcome here in this space. And, you're welcome here too. And I appreciate you, Principal Aguilar, for, making that space warm and welcoming for your parents at your school.
Thanks. So I'm going to go to lightning round in a minute. I'm going to ask one more question of you, Joe. How, we keep hearing conversations about TIF. How realistic is 300 million? What's unrealistic? That is something that last year there was 300 million roughly that went to the district, but what's your instinct on what's likely to happen this year?
So first thing is it may not be the best system, but we rely primarily on TIF for economic development. Economic development is critically important. Growth is the way that we're going to significantly get out of the jam that we're in at all levels of government right now. And so if we engage in short-term thinking through huge sweeps that actually limit our ability to promote economic development, that short-term thinking in and of itself. Second, TIF was not designed for this purpose. But as to the core of your question, last year's sweep, which brought CPS approximately 300 billion, was the biggest in history by a lot. And if we just go back 3 or 4 years, we're talking orders of magnitude. So leaps and bounds. And there is some discussion, my understanding in City Hall, about it being a bigger number this year, but it's not. It could only be part of the solution, one. And so there may be a little bit more, but it's not going to be a game changer in terms of knocking back, and certainly not going to be that 600 million that was being talked about that got you down to the 229 million dollar deficit that Principal Aguilar said, yeah, we kind of knew that wasn't a real number. It's not a real number. We're not going to be there. We're not going to be there in that magnitude. We may see a little bit more, but we have to understand also that there are other things going on, and TIF sweeps are a form of short-term thinking. What they do is they get us some additional money this year, but the same structural issues exist, and we're back here again next year. And then Claiborne saying, we're all just tired. And Principal Aguilar saying, we're just tired having to do this every year. Can we have some certainty? And TIF is not the avenue to certainty.
And thank you. And to be clear, I heard Principal Aguilar say she made a plan A, B, and C. I don't think she specifically.
You know what? I actually think the plan B, C, and D, because plan A is the world that we want. Plan B is the world that we're experiencing. And you were asking what can parents do. I think parents have to support principals who are making the hard decision in Plan B. And if in some respect, if we ask what it is that the new leadership needs to do, it needs to actually articulate what Plan D looks like and carry that to Springfield, not in a public threatening way, but these are the realities that we're dealing with.
Yeah, thank you. All right, lightning round. Start with you, Claiborne. Go to you, Principal Aguilar, and to you, Joe, at the end. Should, given where we are, 730 is being quoted as the deficit. Should CPS make the $175 million pension payment? That's one.
No. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Okay. All right. Let's go. So you said no. So Claiborne's no. Yeah.
Oh,
No, I'll come back for another one. That's yep.
I believe we need to prioritize and ensure that any financial decisions do not compromise our student learning or access to their essential resources.
Okay. Joe?
Short answer, no. The principle should be do no harm. It would do harm for the future. And so the longer version would be hell no.
Okay. All right, back to Claiborne. Do you think that CPS should take out a loan to make that payment? Well, that's already. Do you think CPS should take out a loan?
No payday loans. No.
Okay.
I'm going to stick to my answer and I'm going to say, let's prioritize our students, you know, whatever that might mean. Let's do it very, very carefully if we have to, right? Yeah, it's hard.
Okay.
Same answer. Do no harm. It would be harmful. No.
Okay. If you could give the CPS board president, Sean Harden, the interim CPS CEO, Dr. King, one recommendation, what would it be?
Just to keep our scholars in mind when it comes to making tough decisions. And, you know, I don't think they would have accepted the position if they didn't do that. So keep our scholars the #1 priority when it comes to decision making.
Thank you.
I think for me, I'm going to go back with and I think I mentioned this before, but the recommendation of being in the schools. Every school is different. I think that the decision makers would really benefit from coming closer to the day-to-day realities in our classrooms, in our buildings. Earlier this year, I'm sure everybody knows, the Board of Education was having their board meetings at different schools. And I thought that was really cool. It brought them closer to the communities, right? And really being in our buildings. So I would really love to see that come back. Just more of that presence within the schools would be great.
Joe?
Open up a broader and more meaningful and more engaged dialogue with the governor and leadership in Springfield that is rooted not in demands for money immediately, but rooted in a vision for the particular objectives, the curricular foundation and the outcomes that are part of state law, that are part of the state constitution, that are part of, you know, what it is that CPS itself is dedicated to. Root everything in that rather than the big asks, with an understanding that you have to work from what is reality and not as what is beyond their capacity.
Thank you. And then finally, for the listeners, people watching, you know, what do you hope people most take away from this conversation, particularly parents and educators that are watching?
Well, I want to speak to the parents. You know, as I said before, you know, get involved at your school, your LSTs, you know, PAC, Parent Advisory Council. Call Daniel up, become part of Kids First Chicago. But whatever it takes to get actively involved in your kid's school, community, you know, and hold our, you know, elected officials accountable as well. You know, and if you don't feel that they're, you know, doing the job that you want to see them do, grab a pen and a clipboard and run yourself.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Claiborne.
For me, I'm going to go to that saying, it takes a village, right, to raise a child. And I think principals need all of their village, especially during this time, right? So I would say to families, to staff, that their voice matters, and that we need you now more than ever, right? Navigating through these challenges and understanding that tough decisions have to be made, right? But ultimately, many of us are really working towards the same goal and continue to work towards the same goal, which is making sure that our students have that safe, supportive school environment where they can learn and thrive.
Thank you. Joe?
There are no easy fixes. Put aside the blame. We spend a lot of time arguing about basically where year zero is in our history to ascribe blame to some particular actor who's no longer with us. We are where we are. Embrace that there's no easy fixes. And I'm gonna go back to the principals. Help them to understand your priorities and help them to understand what the core is so that they can make a plan B and a plan C and hopefully not necessarily a plan D that actually protects the things that are singly most important to you and your children in terms of ultimate outcomes, and stop following the adults that are yelling for outcomes that have to do with them and not the kids.
Thank you. With that, I'm just gonna say this has been really amazing for me. It's a gift to be able to moderate this and just hear your perspective. So thank you to all three of you for taking the time out tonight and sharing your wisdom with the audience. I heard, gas, the gas in the car analogy will stick with me. It takes a village. Thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Hal.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Claiborne. Thank you, Principal Aguilar. It was a tremendous panel. Before we jump into our next section, we want to take a quick moment to hear from all of you. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Kristen Pollack, who will walk us through our poll. Kristen.
Thanks, Hal. So we've been talking a lot about some of the financial issues Chicago Public Schools is facing, including the proposed $175 million pension payment and the idea of borrowing to cover that cost. So we are going to ask a poll to help us understand where this community, our audience today, stands on these very issues. And your input will be directly taken to help us shape how we talk to decision makers at Chicago Public Schools and City Hall, as well as partners in the media. So the poll is anonymous, like our opening poll, and will only show the results as a group, but your responses really do matter. So please take a moment to answer the poll you'll see on the screen shortly. We're going to launch a short poll with just 3 questions to get a sense of your views and priorities. You should see the poll appear on your screen now, and I will go ahead and read each question aloud. Question 1, do you think Chicago Public Schools should be required to make the city's $175 million MEABF pension payment this year? The answers are no, the city should cover the cost, yes, CPS should pay it, or not sure, need more information. Question 2, should CPS take out a short-term loan, mainly to cover the city's pension bill, even if it increases long-term debt and interest costs? Answer 1, no, CPS should not take out more debt for this. Answer 2, yes, or not sure, need more information. Finally, question 3, what should CPS prioritize when facing a budget shortfall? 1, protecting classroom funding and student supports. 2, paying off city obligations like pensions. 3, balancing the budget through any means necessary, or not sure. We'll give everyone a minute or so to submit your answers, and then we'll take a look at how the group has answered. Thanks in advance.
Let's see, we're at about 53 of our 94 participants, so we've got about 60% participating, so we'll keep this up for a little bit. But thank you, everyone. This is really important for us to hear your voice. I've got a couple of folks who are saying they can't see the poll. About 65 responses. Let me see. Can everyone see this QR code? I believe you'll also be able to use, if you can, use your phone to scan the QR code. There's another way that you can take the poll that way. Give it about another minute. Final countdown. I'm gonna come back to the screen and then I will click end poll. And if you weren't able to complete it, I apologize. We will have other opportunities after the webinar to share your perspective directly, but thank you. So I'm gonna click end poll and then I'm going to click share results. Kristen, can you see?
Yep, I sure can. So it looks like on question one, we had question one, do you think Chicago Public Schools should be required to make the city's $175 million MEABF pension payment this year? Overwhelmingly, we had 80% say no, the city should cover the cost. 7% said yes, CPS should pay it. And 13% said not sure, need more information. On question number two, which is, should CPS take out a short-term loan mainly to cover the city's pension bill, even if it increases long-term debt and interest costs? We again had an overwhelming majority, 84% said no, CPS should not take on more debt for this. 2% said yes, and 14% said not sure, we need more information. And finally, on question three, what should CPS prioritize when facing a budget shortfall? We once again had an overwhelming majority answer with the first option, protecting classroom funding and student supports, 85%, and 0% said paying off city obligations like pensions, and 9% said balancing the budget through any means necessary, and 5% said not sure. Thank you all for contributing your perspectives.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you to all of you who participated in the poll. Your responses will help us better understand where our communities stand, but also what questions and concerns that we need to keep addressing. So now we're going to shift into the final portion of tonight's webinar, which is what we can all do moving forward, which came up a lot during the panel Q&A. So the next few slides, we'll walk through some very real and very actionable ways that each of you can use your voice to help protect funding for CPS students, classrooms, and schools. Whether you have 2 minutes or a full day to lend your support, there's something here for everyone, and we'll be sharing these links and resources after the webinar too. So let's dive in. First, let's be clear. This isn't about whether the pension system matters, it does. But CPS does not have the money to cover this payment without pulling it from classrooms. Borrowing to make the payment will only lead to deeper cuts next year and in future years. So students and schools will feel the impact either way, unless we say enough. We need real solutions, not short-term patches that will hurt kids in the long run. So this is our moment to make an impact. The interim CPS CEO, Dr. Macklin King, and the CPS board are still finalizing the district's budget. And the board won't vote until August 28th. So between now and then, we have some time to be heard. So first, you can sign a petition that my colleague is going to share in the chat. So you can please sign it yourself. And you can also share it with your friends and family. I'm actually going to just stop sharing screen just for a second. I'm going to bring up that petition because it also includes something else that we think will be helpful. And I'll do this both in English and in Spanish. We have a petition here on our website, which you all just got the link to. And you can see that we also at the bottom have a very helpful explainer video. This is available both in English and Spanish. You can see on the Spanish section here, you can click to view in Spanish. We have it here. We have a explainer video that walks through this budget situation for CPS. And so you can share this with others to help them understand what's at stake. So please do share this with your family, your friends, your members of your community. And we hope this will be a helpful resource in the weeks ahead before that August 28th board vote. We really need everyone who cares about CPS to consider an action that you're willing to take in the weeks ahead. We are also going to be sharing, I'm going to go back to my slides here. My colleague will be sending a link in the chat that will be to a Google form. The Google form is both in English, it's both in Spanish, and there's a litany of options that you can potentially select. You could sign up to speak with a board member. You could attend a CPS board meeting. You can send an email, a statement, a video to your school board member. You'll be able to call the CPS board office to have your voice heard. You can commit to sharing this petition that we just shared a little earlier with other family and friends and community members. You can speak with the media. We can help support you writing an op-ed or a letter to the editor to make your voice heard on this issue. There's going to be a budget. There's actually a CPS board meeting as soon as this Thursday, but there's also going to be budget hearings and a board meeting next month as well. So really, again, if you have 2 minutes, you can share that petition, you can sign it. If you've got a day, you can commit. There'll be an opportunity for you to speak directly to board members. We would love for you to be able to participate in any way that you see fit. So please just remember that every conversation, every signature on that petition counts. And so we hope that you'll be willing to take an action based on what you heard here this evening. And we're going to share all these links, including a link to this webinar recording after tonight's program as well. So with that, before we officially wrap tonight's program, I do want to hand it over to my colleague, Nida De La Rosa, who is our Associate Director of Organizing Community Partnerships here at Kids First Chicago. Nida is going to help close us out, but also share a few next steps for how you can stay connected and to stay involved. So Nida, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Hal. And thank you everyone for being here and for everything that you do for our Chicago students. It speaks volumes that you chose to be here with us on this beautiful summer evening. This moment matters. It's about protecting what's most important in the city, our community schools and its families. We'll follow up tomorrow with a full recording, key resources, and more ways to stay involved. In the meantime, stay connected. Check out our website. Keep spreading the word. Share the petition. Let's make sure our voices are heard before the August 28th CPS board meeting, which is when the final budget is voted on. I also want to just extend an extra thank you to all the wisdom and information shared by our panelists this evening. And just so that we don't forget, right, the incredible amount of planning that it takes, the don't pay for gas with a loan, noted. It takes a village. And I always like to say it takes a village of villages. We are a city with so many beautiful neighborhoods. It takes all of us to come together in solidarity. And together we're stronger. Also keep money in schools by investing in our children. Before we wrap up, we'd really appreciate it if you could just take a minute or two. We know we're over time. We appreciate you sticking with us. We do ask that you complete our short survey. Your feedback helps us to understand, what landed, what could be clearer. How can we make future webinars even more useful and relevant to you? You can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can click the link that that it was just dropped in the chat. Your responses are completely anonymous, and we truly take them into consideration. So again, I appreciate if you could just take the next couple of minutes and answer some questions for us.
And we need survey taking music in the future.
We do, because then I'll start singing, and you don't want that.
Mm.
We'll give another minute. How's it looking, Hal?
I think we can proceed.
Thank you. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. We really appreciate you being a part of this important conversation about the CPS budget and what it means for our students and our schools. We will be following up soon, both with a recap of tonight's event and with clear next steps for how you can stay engaged and make your voice heard in the weeks to come. Together, we can make a real difference for Chicago students. Have a great evening. Be safe. Thank you,
for being
everyone.
here. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night. Buenas noches. Gracias a todos.
Nice work. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. I thought it was really insightful on so many different levels.
Great job setting it all up, everybody. Appreciate being part of this, and frankly, I'm learning by watching you professionals do this. So we'll catch up.
Thank you, Joe. I signed you up for the karaoke for our next webinar. You're
Excellent.
at the top of the list.
That's the
Tell me what
hazing.
song. Let me know what song.
All right. Be well, everybody.
Have a good night. Take care, all.